Hi, everyone. My name is Tatiana Kolovou. This is LinkedIn's stronger live version of the newsletter that I produce for LinkedIn. I'm coming in from sunny Bloomington, Indiana, in the southern part of the state of Indiana, in the middle of the US. And I know many of you come from many parts of the world, and I thank you for that. And I wanted to ask if you could jump on the chat and tell us where you're coming in from. So my guest and I today have a little bit of a reference of our global map. It's truly global. But I wanted to get started with the topic of talking about in-groups and out-groups as we look at our workplace and as we look at organizations. I just got back late last night from visiting my hometown of Athens, Greece. I was there for about a week visiting with family and friends. And it really reminds me every time that I'm there, what is my cultural identity? I've lived in the United States longer than I have been in Greece, and I've traveled to probably 15 other countries around the world. But when I'm there, I'm reminded of my DNA roots of my culture. Why do I believe the things I believe? How do I process things? How do I approach situations? And how do I see people from the rest of the world? Jay, I know you are always such a great super fan. Welcome from the UAE. And as well as Pavin being with us, and Shelby is always the backbone of our lives. So I want you to think about, as we discuss communication as it relates to our cultural identity today and sets us in a setting with many other people in the workplace. Why do you act and behave the way you do, and how do others perceive you? There's a lot of components of self-awareness. There's a lot of understanding of core values. We have a friend from Peru and one of my favorite countries, Sao Paulo, Brazil. So in the newsletter of Stronger this month, I talked about in-groups and out-groups. This also is based on a LinkedIn learning course on cultural humility and agility that I was able to produce with LinkedIn a couple of years ago. So in-groups are the groups that are our people, the people that we connect with, our families, our teams, our soccer clubs and groups, our friends from high school that we have. But as we grow and relate and connect in the workplace, these are the people that we get work done and we see on a regular basis. So what's the responsibility that we have to bring people that are new to the group in? If we're in the in-group, and especially if we're a leader of the in-group, we have the responsibility to bring people in. But we may also find ourselves in the out-group. I was a newcomer to this culture, or many others. I'm in a university town. Many others come in from all parts of the world and are outsiders. How do they adapt, and how are they flexible to enter these in-groups? So we'll talk about in-group and out-group today. On the newsletter that I produced, I talked a lot about having some self-awareness, knowing what our core values are, as I talked about, where does identity come from, and how does it influence our behaviors. I talked about the responsibility of leaders that they have to be good listeners and be self-aware themselves and be the ones to have the responsibility to bring people in the in-group. I talked about being culturally agile, asking lots of open-ended questions to get to know others. But I didn't want to have this discussion on my own. A good friend and colleague who I met here on this platform is Simeon Quarrie. He is the CEO of VIVIDA, a fantastic and very, I would say, progressive learning company. He's coming in from England right now, where he's sipping his tea like a true Brit. So we're going to bring him in and say hi to us. I'm looking at where others are coming. Vula from Greece, welcome and thank you. There you go. And you know, I'm drinking a cold, bubbly lime flavored drink. So that's my my American approach to this. Simeon, when I looked at my notes back in our correspondence, we met in August of 2020. So here it is, close to nearly 4.5 years of knowing one another. And for all of you here, we have never met in person. Simeon and I have always connected on the platform, and we have behind the scenes meetings talking about how everyone is doing. Is this training appropriate to freelancers for team projects, perhaps? Yes, yes, and yes, my friend. So stand by, because we will discuss a lot of what you're interested in hearing. But before we get started, and I ask Simeon my first question, if you put hashtag stronger into the discussion right now, you get a chance to be in a drawing for a tumbler, a nice drink, stronger labeled and marked, a piece of swag that we like to give that I have not even want to showcase because I've given mine away. So please do hashtag stronger on the list. Simeon, welcome. Where are you and how is the weather? Places that we always begin with in conversations.
Firstly, thank you for having me. It's really great to kind of have a conversation. I mean, in some ways for us, this is normal because this is kind of what we do. We hang out and we chat. It's just brilliant that we get to include everyone else in the conversation as well. I'm in an area called Salisbury. So many of you might be familiar with Stonehenge, very ancient kind of rock formation. I'm not far from that. Outside right now, I have beautiful fields and I can see wildlife. I'm in a very rural area and the weather is good, but it looks good, but the need for a tea is definitely still there.
It's also a little later in the day for you. I'm in the morning, you're in the evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Simeon, you've created a learning company that goes into organizations, does a lot of listening for what the issues might be, and provides opportunities for people to become aware together. Would that be a good way to describe what you do? They're learning together, but their awareness is increasing. Is that right?
Yes. In fact, I'm going to steal your description and use it. Watch the website.
Yeah. It's not just a training company because every company that comes to you has different issues. And by the way, for everyone listening, Simeon plays in the cybersecurity field. And I've really peppered him with questions of, why not in shipping? Why not in retail? Why not in banking? And he said, pause for a minute. Which industry has the most stress of, what did you describe of getting invaded 2 times a second when it happened to your company?
Yeah, there's a thing. It's very unusual that you get threats that come from outside an organization. It's almost you have this opponent that's there, and that can create, stress and anxiety for the individuals that manage an organization, and then for all of us who work in an organization in some form of capacity. We're trying to have the right behaviors. So trying to get that across in a way that's meaningful is important.
So the in-group has to all pull together. The team has to be strong. The team has to have trust. The team has to have understanding. The team cannot have bickering and gossiping and all of that stuff because the team has to focus on the task at hand. Let's keep the organization safe, secure, and the cyberspace that we cover definitely available for all the users. Maybe they're in banking or whatever else. Hello, Maricel from the Philippines. I told you we've got places all over the world. So that, Simeon, and have you done some work with other industries or you're playing mainly in cybersecurity?
So we've done a lot of work on the culture side. In some ways, what we're really looking at is the internal culture that is within organizations. You've got a group of people working together, trying to progress with a common mission. And there are things that can disrupt that. And so I guess what we end up really thinking about is, and what cultures do we need to positively affect? So when we think about cybersecurity, actually, we're thinking more about how do we help create a culture that is safe and secure. Another type of culture that's important is one that has an understanding of each other, peer-to-peer, also leadership, where everyone is inclusive, essentially.
Right. Well, we respect one another's values, understand where people are coming from. In the newsletter I wrote, I talked about self-awareness, where we begin from, and we start thinking, why do I think this? Let me pause and see if I can understand why the other person thinks this. That takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of trust. But one word that you and I share a lot when we chat is empathy. How do we build that in an organization? And tell me more about that. Does an organization that has a lot of empathy from what you've seen for one another bypass all the miscommunication?
I think it helps. You know, what we try to do is we try to avoid misunderstandings that happen within our organizations, and that can be from amongst leadership. It can be colleagues of all kind of levels within an organization. But when we look at kind of utilizing and creating empathy internally, we can be sometimes thinking that a misunderstanding is really about some type of dispute, right?
Mhm.
But by the time you get to like a dispute, you're really at the maybe the far end of a misunderstanding. But I
Yeah.
prefer to reframe that misunderstanding really from a perspective of um, where do we maybe sometimes have some wrong assumptions
Mhm.
and maybe misappropriated stereotypes that may affect our communication, our relationships, and also the decisions that we may
Right.
make.
Or biases, as we say. We come into a situation, oh, I know, you're going to be doing this or talking like this because that's what you did last time, or that's what your department tends to approach things with. We still have more people coming in from the Netherlands, and I've got all my Greek friends that are coming in. It's a national holiday tomorrow in Greece. We have one of our 2 Independence Days, so I'm impressed that people are coming in when the weather is so much nicer there. Diba, thank you. So you and I talk about the ability for you to come in as a training company and scale up empathy. Do you measure this working? Do the organizations say, processing some of the training videos or having discussions helped us in this way? Or does it happen through projects? Talk to us. How do you scale up empathy as a skill?
Yeah, look, that's the real challenge. The first thing that people tend to try to do, which is correct, is listen. Right? It's the same as you do with an individual, but that needs to happen individual to individual. But some of the organizations we end up working with have got 100,000 people in them.
Wow.
That's on the extreme end, right? 100,000
Wow.
people in one of the companies we've worked with. So there's a lot of communication that needs to happen. There's also a lot of understanding that needs to happen. And for those of you that are not in organizations of that size, the same principles 100% apply. Now, when we start with listening, that comes in different forms, right? So you might have those listening groups,
Mm-hmm.
listening sessions. Sometimes it might be survey data
Yep.
as well. Many have cultural surveys internally. But that listening is a really good, important foundation, right? That kind of data gathering.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's about how do you then take that information, that data, and then scale it so that more people can then start to benefit. In some ways, that the listening is the foundation, but it's like,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do next? There's so many organizations that sometimes do a great job of doing the listening, but don't manage to convert it into something
Action.
that then into action.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And what I've learned as a consultant too, if there's no action, there's more loss of trust. Then maybe they get points for trying to create an initiative, but if there's no action or there's some decisions, they lose trust from people in the larger group. You mentioned 100,000 people in some of the organizations. I would also add in probably 1,000 different places in the world, would you say, or in the country, in Europe, in the world? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of approach scales up
Yep.
and scales down,
Yeah.
right? And you are talking about these layers of abstraction here, where the same core principles
Right.
definitely apply.
So, from a communication standpoint, you have the issue of trying to explain and create a training that everyone understands. And in just a little bit, we're going to show you what Simeon and his team create, which I find fascinating. But I did want to touch upon, you mentioned listening. One of our friends that came earlier said, I'm an independent contractor. I'm sure he, depending on what he has to develop or deliver, has to do a lot of listening. Quite often, as outsiders, we come in to try to figure out what are some of the issues? What is the problem? What does great look like? and what does it look like if we are successful, what are we able to accomplish? So I wanted to see if one of the things that Simeon and his team does is create a series for companies, very customized. This is not something that you're going to see in the internet anywhere or on LinkedIn, although you do a few little previews. In Their Shoes is a series that's customized for organizations. Do you want to kind of tell us how this was created?
Yeah, so interestingly, I was getting involved in creating virtual reality. And so actually, if I backtrack a little bit of personal story,
Sure.
so you understand sort of where I'm coming from, is I'm an individual like many of your listeners who struggled quite a bit with learning when I was growing up, right? The way that information was given to me, for me, it was the whiteboard. The blackboards had just
Blackboard.
stopped.
Yeah.
It was the OHP. Some of you remember that, you know, the box with the lights where you put the, you know, the translucent sheet over the top and have to kind of copy things down. So as a result, there were a lot of subjects that were actually really important that just did not resonate with me at all. But I realized that when there was a context, a story behind it, and there was a reason why, and things were delivered in quite a creative way, all of a sudden I really started to get it. Started to click. So I started to have to find ways to make subjects, because the school system didn't do it at the time, had to try and find ways to make subjects interesting to me. So I kind of worked through my own little framework, right? I wouldn't class myself as an academic. I lean more on the visual, on the creative and the communication side. So that's that's how I reworked things. Fast forward, I realized that accidentally, without realizing it, the thing that organizations were working with me for was to take things that were complicated and make them simple and easy to understand. Or maybe it would be taking something that people were apathetic toward and turning it into something that people cared about.
Sure.
Create something where we try to make something matter so that essentially it ended up sticking.
Yeah.
So as we went through, I started tinkering with all sorts of technologies. Sometimes we started with a video and animation. And one day I stumbled on this virtual reality. And so I created this experience where I would create an individual, and you could place somebody inside a person and look at this environment from their perspective. So one day I was thinking, what would be the most useful way to use this approach in this technology? And I started to think, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just put people in the shoes of another so that people could see lived experience from a different perspective? For me, as a young Black person, I'm not so young now, but back then I was younger, always away on a daily basis. But back then I was like, I wish people could maybe understand a little bit about where I was coming from or some of my struggles. And then I started to realize, wait a minute, as I created this character, I actually needed to understand things not just from my own perspective, but from the perspective of others. So I went on my own listening journey, and then I crafted a VR story with another organization or two. And then fast forward, virtual reality is fantastic. It's highly immersive, but it wasn't the most accessible. So In Their Shoes, in essence, was me taking that, listening to the stories of others, being genuinely curious, and then using storytelling to allow people to experience a scenario, a situation from the perspective of another, in the hope that you would never see the world the same again. So you see things different. And if that happens, then you start to, make decisions in a different way.
I have so many questions about the process of this, and I'd like our learners to remember #stronger if you're joining us now, but also drop some questions for Simeon as well of what happens next. So you're going to show us just a 1-minute little taster, but then if I work for a large organization, I get an email from my supervisor saying, we're going to be discussing this in the next training, watch this, and then we debrief. Is there facilitation? How does it happen asynchronously? Or maybe show us and then tell us.
Yeah, it's a real mix. So once the story is crafted and shaped, then individuals or teams can experience that. And the key thing ends up being the discussion that sometimes happens whilst it's being created, because we're having to listen and form stories, build empathy and understanding. Then we create, and then afterwards, what we've ended up doing, that then goes out to thousands of people across an organization, or sometimes in those smaller groups.
Sure.
Now, then afterwards, what happens is of course, there are the maybe evaluations that would take place. People start to monitor data, like what's happening with the cultural surveys internally as well. And then also maybe sometimes, well, what has happened is some of the decisions or processes start to change within organizations because they're starting to see things from a different perspective. The example I'll show you will be one that's to do with a young lady who's got a particular characteristic. She's a young Black lady. However, we've done other experiences where we've created and crafted based on neurodiversity, and what's a lived experience like there, or what's it like for a leader or a manager having a difficult conversation.
Which so much we talked about that last month with the role playing. Absolutely. So everyone, let's watch In Their Shoes that Simeon will share with us, and drop in some questions that you may have as you process this. I'm going to let you drive the bus here.
All right, let me see what I can do.
I've just found out that Gloria Abuaje has handed in her notice. How could toxic culture be her reason for resignation? I want to get to the bottom of this. We need your team's help to identify what we're getting wrong. After making a special request, Human Resources has just sent me Gloria's file, including personal messages. Gloria has agreed that this information will only be shared with you. I need to show her we understand and can change. Your findings will be shared with me as you go. You've got 30 minutes.
I so much love this, because what we forgot to tell our learners here is this also is an interactive game where they have to figure out what happens. I was thinking a training session, I show the video, then we discuss this. They're going through it as they are learning it and figuring out what the solution is. I wonder if any of our learners have gone through this in their companies or have been exposed to this. And asking you, Simeon, what is the feedback that you hear from the users, from the learners?
Yeah, it's thank you. It's been overwhelmingly positive. I think one of the things we have to recognize with certain subjects, they are uncomfortable to talk about sometimes in the workplace, right? Because we have a particular perspective and we're busy. We want to get on with doing the job, and sometimes it just feels like this is a load of extra work that's unnecessary, even though in reality it's vitally important to having successful and strong teams. So what happens is this sparks thought, conversation. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to create an approach that would scale safe space conversations. Right? But what we also wanted to do is have a number of guardrails. And so that's where it's very powerful when, if you've listened and you've gathered insights and data from, and that's qualitative and quantitative data.
Sure.
Use that then to craft the story and the narrative. And then you're able to have thousands of people go through, either as individuals or in groups. Sometimes that happens remotely, like we're doing now. The experiences kind of connects to the cameras, etc. Or in other times we have, let's say, for us here in the UK, we have our fire service. Right? We've got a number of challenges. And they will be going through in room together, having discussion about different scenarios.
Wow. I have to say, hats off to organizations that step into the vulnerability space of saying, we do have some of these issues and we want to address them too. Jennifer says, Love the behavior change use of gamification, especially for the video game generations like mine. I'm seeing that a lot of workspaces still consolidate power and generations before mine, and this approach as effective for them. Is this because the leaders making a decision approach it from their preferences and learning? Do you see this, what Jennifer's saying?
Yeah, so we've had to really think about this from
The users.
all generations.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the way that we had to do this was really interesting. When we create the experience, we often get to observe and to watch how the discussions are going. And sometimes then we are able to refine. We have seen this experience be run, I have to be careful what I say, to the highest levels. I've been in rooms with the highest levels of people, I'm just going to say in a government, so you can't work out which.
Wow.
Where they're responsible for hundreds of thousands of people, and watching a team dynamic as they discuss, why does this individual feel like this? What decisions should we make? What decisions would our employees or colleagues make in our organization based on the protocols and procedures that we've created? Mm-hmm. Actually, what now needs to change? The technology there, like, I get it. It looks modern, right? And it looks fancy. But if we just simplify this down a bit so that it's the type of tool that anybody can use here.
Yeah.
We're using the principle of storytelling.
Yeah.
And that principle of storytelling, yes, we've used technology to do it. But what we're doing is we are creating a protagonist. A protagonist is a character in a story that you root for.
Yeah.
Typically, a protagonist is someone who's got a little vulnerability. There's something that makes you lean in because they're like, oh, there's a reason why they've got a little something about them. But what really matters is where they're going, where they're trying to get to, and why do they want to get there?
Sure.
And then what obstacles do they have that are in the way as they try to go on that journey? So what we end up doing is crafting a protagonist.
Yeah, and it's so much stickier. But again, I say how brave that is for the organizations that, given the time and money and investment of saying, this is something we need to address, and we address it in this way. And as Jennifer was saying, trying to do it, because I have another newsletter that talks about differences in communication in the workplace. It gets very, very complex. How long does it take you from conception of or the first meeting, let's chat about what you need, to the point where you kick off something like this in an organization?
So it varies. We've many will have seen the work referenced with HSBC, which is a huge global bank. Mm-hmm. Theirs was a very long program because we dealt with it as a program. So we started off with listening sessions, and then we actually co-collaborated with the crafting. So sometimes we actually went in with the 3D technology and we let them see us build the 3D world based on the insights that we had gained from the people of the protagonist. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we decided that we wanted to create an experience based on neurodiversity. From that, we would have listened and we'd gained a number of insights, and then we can actually shape the experience to that. Then afterwards, we released in a number of chapters over a period of time.
Okay.
In other times, we've actually crafted an experience where we've gathered this research from a number of organizations. And what we end up doing is looking at the data that's being gathered, and then we will map to what they need. So we're making customization. So one sometimes has been a work that's taken place over 2 years. In other cases, we will need to be up and running in 3 months.
Wow. So
we just adapt the approach accordingly.
Yeah. But because it's technology, you can make a few tweaks and replicate it. You don't have to design it from scratch. I love the concept of ancient way of learning of storytelling, and connecting it with technology and being able to influence thousands of people at the same time in an organization. Diba shares or asks us a question: what strategies can we implement to ensure that our team actually learns from past mistakes rather than just documenting them. I'm going to take a moment to discuss this as you think about this, because I had the advantage of seeing the question earlier from Diba. Diba, I think sometimes organizations care or connect or write stories of examples of things that have happened. And if they have a way to collect these stories, sort of their DNA of their organizational approach around some of their values, whether it's customer service or whether it's a deep level of listening to colleagues or understanding of common values, if they are able, besides technology, to collect some of the stories, people, I don't know, implementing to ensure our team actually learns from past mistakes, there has to be some debriefing, wouldn't you say? Simeon, how else do you ensure that you learn? What data do you collect to prove that? I'm not sure. I would build awareness, but I'm not sure how do I get to the measurement of that.
Yeah, one of the reasons why as we built our platform, we maybe ask questions and we can actually start to measure certain interactions. We map that interactions to areas of the organization. So because of the sensitivity of the subject, we don't map it to an individual.
Yeah.
What that means is we can actually start to go, in this part of the organization, the responses here to the storyline was such and such and such and such. So then you get some tangible data that you can then start to work from. The point there that you also make about ensuring the team learns from past mistakes, actually the first thing to do is actually surface them, bring them out into the open, and have conversations on them, which is what we've been trying to do here. So many mistakes stay in the past, or stay hidden as the past, but they stay hidden. The aim is to bring them up into an environment where there's that psychological safety to actually have a conversation around it. And so there has to be some developing of that psychological safety. The other thing you can do as well is take what we would call near miss data and then overlap that on top of an organization. And sometimes that feels like a more palatable way for an organization to lean into difficult conversations. So what I mean by that is airlines, what airlines do, and the flight industry, they will take an incident, a plane crash that's taken place or something that's happened at the airport, and they created a model where they would take that data and then overlay it over their airline or over their airport and say, what would happen if this happened here? How would we respond? How would we act? Do we have the same vulnerabilities that organization had?
Great. Yeah.
And what decisions should we make as a result?
In the banking world, they call those stress tests, but in a way they take something that really has happened and apply it. Many of our learners here may not have access to the VR world, may not have access to the trainings in this much detail. But if you can ask yourself, as Simeon said, what do I wish I know now that I wish I knew then? How can I help inform others around me to help them in their training? Or maybe be vulnerable and say, what were some assumptions that I made before that I realized were wrong? And what have I learned? As a leader, in even a group and in a team, when you are able to communicate that, you make it safer for others to do the same, but you also set the stage for showing that you're moving forward into a better tomorrow. We are talking already about this, but back to we started talking about an in-group and an out-group. When someone like the protagonist you just shared, she feels that the environment is toxic, so she's leaving. So she probably was not in that group for too long. What is the responsibility of the leader? In your case, they create these trainings, but if we didn't have VR and if we didn't have Simeon to facilitate this, what do you suggest that they do?
Yeah, love that. So for one, just to note, we've moved away from the virtual reality to make it as accessible as possible. So it's just a simple online experience. But I think that the conversations are accessible, and trying to create that psychological safety is also something that's that I think is really accessible. It's just trying to turn those listening. So what we have to do is we have to gather data and we have to gather insights, and that requires honesty. And for some, as I mentioned, that might be cultural surveys and forms. Hopefully it's discussion and it's conversation. And from that, we then need to be able to do something with it. But what we have to do is have to remember that it's leaders' responsibilities to make sure that they create an environment that has that ability to communicate, just as they do on the business level, right? In order to define the mission, have everyone pulling together on the same mission, there has to be really strong communication.
Right.
And that then also has to move beyond just the product creation and the delivery of services to the internal service that an organization has to create and has a mandate to create, which is an environment that is conducive, I guess, to everyone working together in an effective way. When I think about, though, the kind of the inner group and the kind of the outer group and that dynamic, the responsibility is realistically is there for everybody, yes, but it is two-way. So one of the things I start to think about is if you imagine back to ancient times, just to create a picture in your head, and you would have had clans or groups in different geographic locations. What you would have had is you would have had ambassadors, right? You would have had envoys, for example,
and messengers that would run back and forth to deliver the messages. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just about you staying within your environment, right?
Yeah.
It was the responsibility to make sure that as a collective, there were those that were going out. And as leaders, that's our job, right? To make sure that we also spend time and maybe talking to people that may be unlike us, or those that may be in that kind of outside group. Big organizations talk about bringing the outside world in, for example. It's that recognition that actually there's a lot of value and there's that job to do, but it isn't just about the internal organization or the inner circle kind of going out. It's the other side as well, making themselves approachable, but also understanding that you might be going into an environment that is very, very different. So you also have to adapt
and be flexible. Jennifer makes another comment that mid-sized organizations, it's helpful to hire a facilitator for this data gathering and difficult discussion process. I find quite often as a facilitator myself, it's easier for an outsider to ask those questions that maybe the people in the groups have not asked each other enough. But it is about asking these difficult questions or building enough trust that you can get to that. And are facilitators involved, or do you leave this up to the companies?
We've taken many different approaches. My personal passion is building technology that's scalable, that can have maximum reach.
Yeah.
So I love it when we see other facilitators internally or externally to the organization take those experiences forward.
Love it.
There was definitely a learning that we had that's in line with Jennifer's advice. We worked with a mid-sized organization. They really benefited from having someone external. We've had some organizations that have actually spun up these experiences in their hundreds internally without a facilitator, because we have a built-in facilitator that walks you through the discussion.
And I wonder if AI will allow you to scale even more now, because you have the data and you have ways to train the models with some of the questions, right?
Yeah, very exciting.
That's another LinkedIn Live. Before we leave, I want to hone in more on what we all individually can do. And you and I have these discussions quite often. What are behaviors that we can do on a regular basis of getting to know each other's stories? I think I told you last week, I was in Greece and I was picking up a car from a parking garage, and it was late at night. And I just asked the guy that was working there, it was 11. And I said, is it going to be a long night? I said something like this. And he started telling me, yeah, I don't get off until 8 in the morning. And then I said, so tell me, what's your day like? In the meantime, I just took a few minutes to hear his story. And he said, here's what I work. He works from 7 p.m. to 8 a.m., goes to bed at 10:30 a.m., wakes up at 5 p.m., and then turns around and does it again. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, thank you so much for asking. And I left there thinking, I just asked a curious question and open. It may have been, as if he didn't want to share, he probably would have said, you're making me uncomfortable. Why are you asking? But I asked for caring purposes, and he appreciated it so much. I think from my end, to saying, what can we do, is to genuinely want to get to know where people are coming from so we can be in their shoes. What I'm trying to say, what other things can we do? And then we have a question that will jump in. What other things can we do on a daily basis that helps build that empathy and build that communication?
I think it's making sure that we're curious about other individuals that we are in connection with, whether that be colleagues. When I mentioned that storytelling structure, right, the key thing there is that character.
Yeah.
You have to ideally try to understand where they're at and where they're trying to get to.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what we do when we build relationships, and then try to understand, okay, what are the obstacles that they may have?
Mm-hmm.
But where do we see ourselves in that? Actually, if we try to see ourselves as the guide, we then become more empathetic, right?
Yep.
So if you imagine, visualize in your mind that hero's journey that many are familiar with, there's this character, and the video I showed you was Gloria, right? This character's
Sure.
got an aim, wants to support the family, wants to be really effective, wants to progress to leadership, etc. And then you see, there's a few challenges here. Now, my job is go, right, how can I be the guide? The moment you place yourself in that mindset of being a guide, you start to then be more curious,
Sure.
work out how you can assist and work out how you can help.
Sure. Our LinkedIn user friend is saying, how can one adapt communication styles to engage both insiders, outsiders, while respecting cultural and organizational differences? This does get tricky, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. What a brilliant question. So I paused to think about that. Again, I think that's why the curiosity is so key. Because if we're curious and through conversation, we'll start to we'll start to learn and we'll start to find out. And this one of the learnings that we had when we worked with HSBC. We recreated a scenario that was based on being in an interview.
Mm-hmm.
So we created a character called Josiah who was in an interview. And what we started to find out was, okay, why was this character's body language quite contained? Maybe sometimes wasn't necessarily displaying the outspokenness and the body language that was related to leadership. And that was very easily misinterpreted based on the data that we had found from the lived experiences of people, not just in that organization, but prior.
In general.
And there were actually some cultural elements there, things that your parents would have said to you or said to me, your aunties, uncles, etc. So then all of a sudden, with that cultural awareness, then you're able to adapt the way we listen and actively listen, but then also actively communicate.
Absolutely. And catch yourself making that assumption. Back to our friend's question there, I would say in order to be respectful and be accepted, you need to do your homework. And homework comes from learning and understanding. And even if I say, in order to be sure I can communicate in the best way possible, Simeon, I need to ask you a couple of questions. So that would be sort of before I need to communicate with you, I can ask you about your preferences, your styles, or what's best for you and what environment is best for you, because that's how I know you will receive the information and listen. And that goes back to, I deliver something in the way that you can approach it too.
Just to add one tiny bit on there as well is that the adapt is key. Be prepared that your communication style will adapt as you find more data or as you sync up. It's not
Yeah.
something that stays absolutely fixed.
Yeah.
You'll develop that relationship, that communication will then start to adapt over time.
And our friend Jay says, adapting to a person can be spontaneous process when we want to interact better with that person. But that makes the assumption, Jay, too, that we are aware, we are flexible, and that we don't set ourselves saying, okay, this is how Simeon likes to communicate. I will always follow this process. We need to be agile in order to be effective in the long term, too. There are a few other tips that we talked about for everyone that can be able to use. And one is very specific. I remember very well. It has to do with names and pronunciations.
Yeah, that can just be a really good way of starting that communication off on the right foot. It's almost like the opening can be the simple opening move, particularly when you have someone with an unusual name. So sometimes that might be the question that gets asked.
Yeah.
How do I pronounce your name? Automatically, then you started off with a beautiful communication, relationship building kind of starter and opener. Some, though, like me, who maybe have a name that could be assumed as a spelling mistake. So many will assume my name is Simon, and I've accidentally quickly typed it in wrong. So I might start off being empathetic. Go, hey, I'm Simeon. Can I ask, like, what's your name? And then sometimes that spins off onto other little bits, like, oh, what does it mean, or where does it come from?
For sure.
And they can be nice, a really good way of getting into conversation. But it's also really important because one of the pieces of the data that we found from a number of organizations that we work with is that when there's a fear around pronunciation of name, that disrupts the communication that happens in a group setting. You can picture the boardroom or the team meeting where someone who's leading might be thinking, I know I want to talk to this individual, ask for opinion, but I'm not sure of the name. So they end up being the last person that gets asked.
Yeah.
And often it's like, oh, we've run out of time, but I'd love to get your thoughts afterwards.
Yeah.
For that individual, it may be an experience that they've had over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so starting off with that, something simple, like trying your best to get that name, to understand how to pronounce it, can be really, really key.
For sure. Or I like the one we said of like, tell me your story. I should have started with that with you. Like, how did you get there? Tell me a little bit. We have to be sensitive that the other person doesn't feel like, why are you asking me and not everyone else? Or asking the person to say, let's share a little bit about where are we coming from? How does this blend into what brings us here together and our common values? We need all of this. Is the common denominator is taking the time and having the patience to build on to that. But my friends, and Simeon agrees with me, is if you don't do that, there's more of an opportunity for miscommunication, and showing that, as we say here, our friend Melanie, gaining insight, cultural differences is important. Listening and better understanding is helpful. It will help in the long run, for sure.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, that's a really great point.
Simeon, thank you so much for taking time to sip tea and have this important conversation and showcase to us how well and how pivotal technology will be in learning and understanding and embracing cultural differences. And I wanted to just say, is there one thing people should take away from today? Is there one thing you want them to remember as they walk away from our conversation?
I think I'd love people to take away that understanding people's story is a really powerful tool that can build empathy. And that can be at an individual level, but it can also be scaled organization-wide as well.
Fantastic close. So go search for the stories and be opening to listening to what you hear. Thank you so much for participating. We're going to do a quick drawing on all of the names that we have coming in here today that were in our live, and put in #stronger. Our users, and Jay, be well, my friend. Thank you. We're going to do the little drawing now and see, and then we will reach out to you and ask for your address so we can mail that to you. Simeon, again, thank you so much for being with us. I know you and I will talk again. Marley, thank you. I think Marley was with us last time as well. Be well, everyone. Goodbye. And we will talk to you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.